I'm about to show you how to make cooking gas out of garbage. Not a metaphor, not a science fair curiosity that lights a match for 2 seconds. Real, usable, burning gas. Enough that in some parts of the world, millions of families cook every single meal with it. Every day, from nothing but food scraps and animal manure. It costs them nothing. It never runs out, and no truck ever comes to refill it. Here's the part that should genuinely bother you. This is not new technology, and it is not foreign technology. In 1859, a hospital in Bombay built a plant to collect this gas and use it. By 1895, the city of Exeter in England was lighting its street lamps with gas taken directly out of the town sewers. Victorian engineers understood this, built it, and ran it in public. And then, in the West, it vanished so completely that if you mention it today, most people assume you've made it up. Now, I need to correct something in the very first minute, because if I don't, you'll go out and try this, and it will fail, and you'll think I lied to you. Your compost heap in the corner of the garden is not going to produce this gas. It can't. And understanding exactly why is the entire key to the whole thing. Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll know precisely what turns rotting waste into fuel. Why the Victorians could do it, and your grandmother couldn't. The honest reason it disappeared here, while millions of households abroad still run on it, and the 3 safety rules that genuinely matter. Because this is one of the few topics where getting it wrong can hurt you. Let me start with the thing that's happening in your compost pile right now, and why it's the wrong thing. When you turn a compost heap, you're deliberately putting air into it. That's the whole practice, and in that oxygen-rich environment, a particular set of microbes goes to work. Aerobic microbes, the ones that need air. They break your scraps down efficiently, they generate a lot of heat, which is why a good pile steams on a cold morning, and they produce carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide does not burn. You could pipe the output of the finest compost heap in the world into a stove, and nothing would happen. That's your open pile, and it will never make fuel, no matter what anyone tells you. Now, take that exact same waste and do the opposite. Seal it in a container with no air at all. Everything changes. The aerobic microbes die off because they can't breathe, and in their place, a completely different community takes over anaerobic microbes, organisms that evolved in airless mud, in swamps, in the bottoms of ponds, in the guts of animals. They break down the same waste in a totally different way, through several stages, and the final group in that chain are called methanogens, and what they exhale is methane. Those stages are worth a moment, because they explain why a digester behaves like a living thing rather than a machine. First, one group of microbes tears the big molecules, the fats, proteins, and carbohydrates in your waste, into smaller pieces. Then a second group ferments those pieces into simple acids. A third converts those into acetic acid, hydrogen, and carbon dioxide. And only then do the methanogens, the slowest and fussiest of the lot, take that output and turn it into methane. It's a relay race, and every runner has to be alive and working for the baton to reach the end. Which is exactly why a digester can go sour. Overload it with too much feed at once, and the acid makers race ahead. The pH crashes, and the delicate pathogens at the end of the chain die off. Gas production stops, and you have to nurse it back over weeks. Feed it steadily, and the whole chain stays in balance. Methane is natural gas. It is the same molecule that comes out of the pipe into a gas stove, which means those microbes, sealed in a barrel of garbage, are producing the identical fuel that a utility company sells you through a meter. That's the whole secret. Not a recipe, not a device, a condition. Air, and you get heat and carbon dioxide. No air, and you get fuel. It's the difference between a compost pile and a swamp. And now you understand something you've probably seen your whole life without thinking about it. That bubbling in a stagnant pond, the gas that rises when you disturb the mud at the bottom of a marsh. The old stories of ghostly flames flickering over bogs at night. That's this same process happening on its own. Marsh gas. People have been watching it burn for as long as there have been marshes and people. The only thing that took thousands of years was working out how to catch it. Which brings us to the Victorians, and the part of this story nobody tells. By the 1800s, science had figured out what marsh gas actually was, that it was combustible, and eventually that it was being produced by living microorganisms rather than by simple rotting. That was a real intellectual breakthrough of the era. the realization that these bubbles were the exhaust of invisible life. But the Victorians didn't stop at understanding it. They built with it. In 1859, at a leper colony hospital in Bombay, a plant was constructed to capture the gas from waste, the first recorded biogas installation anywhere in the world. Think about who built that and why. Not a wealthy utility. An institution full of people who needed light and heat. Sitting on an endless supply of the one raw material they'd otherwise have to pay to dispose of, then, in 1895, in Exeter, England, engineers did something that still delights me. The city was already collecting sewage. That sewage was already producing gas, so rather than vent it and waste it, they piped it off and used it to fuel street lamps. Public lighting, in a Victorian English city, running on the gas from the town's own sewers. There were even specially designed lamps built to burn off sewer gas. That is not a fringe experiment. That is municipal infrastructure. The Victorians looked at human waste and saw a fuel supply, and then they wired their streets to it. So what happened? Why isn't this everywhere? And here I'm not going to sell you a conspiracy, because the truth is simpler and, I think, more irritating. What happened is that fuel got cheap. Enormously, historically cheap. Natural gas fields were tapped and vast pipeline networks were built. Propane became a commodity you could have delivered to a tank in your yard by a man in a truck for very little money. And the moment fuel became that cheap and that convenient, the economics of making your own collapsed. Why would you build, feed, monitor, and maintain a digester, a thing that needs daily attention, that works slower in winter, that produces a modest, steady trickle of gas when a truck will fill a tank for pocket change and you never think about it again? Nobody erased it. It just stopped making financial sense in wealthy countries with cheap piped fuel and a sanitation system that took your waste away for free. And technologies that stop making financial sense don't get argued about. They simply stop being taught until nobody remembers them at all. But here's what makes that story so revealing. In places where fuel was not cheap and where waste was not carried away for you, this technology never went anywhere. It exploded across rural India and China. Household biogas digesters have been built in enormous numbers, tens of millions of units. A family keeps a few animals, feeds the manure and kitchen waste into a sealed digester in the yard, and pipes the gas into a simple stove in the kitchen. That's their cooking fuel permanently. And they get a second product out of it that matters just as much. What comes out the other end is a slurry that's a genuinely excellent fertilizer with the nutrients still in it, ready to go back on the fields. So consider what that household actually built. They took a waste disposal problem and turned it into a fuel supply and a fertilizer supply in one sealed tank with no ongoing cost. Meanwhile, the equivalent household in the West pays to have its waste hauled away, pays for propane, and pays for fertilizer, 3 separate bills, for 3 sides of the same loop, because fuel was cheap enough for long enough that we forgot the loop existed. And here's the twist that makes the whole story sting a little more. This technology never actually left the West. It just left our homes. Go to almost any large municipal wastewater treatment plant today, and you'll find enormous sealed digesters doing exactly what that Bombay hospital did in 1859, and many of those plants burn the gas to run their own operations, in some cases, producing much of the power they need on site. Large livestock farms install digesters to handle manure and generate electricity from it, and every modern landfill is, in effect, an accidental digester. Waste, buried under compacted earth, goes anaerobic, produces methane for decades, and rather than let it vent, operators drill wells into the pile and capture it, which is how landfill gas ends up in pipelines and power stations. So the engineering is alive and well and running at industrial scale. Quietly, out of sight, in facilities most people never visit. The only thing that disappeared was the household version, the small, personal, domestic one that a family could own. That's the piece we let go of. And it's the piece millions of families elsewhere never did. All right, let's talk about how it actually works, because the machine is simpler than you'd think. Every digester, from a mud brick pit in a village to a stainless steel unit at a wastewater plant, has the same 4 parts. An inlet, where you feed material in a sealed airless chamber, where the microbes work. A gas outlet at the top, because the gas rises and collects in the headspace. And an outlet for the leftover slurry, which is your fertilizer. There are 3 classic shapes this takes, and they're worth knowing because you'll see all of them if you start looking. The floating drum design is the old Indian standard, a pit or tank of slurry with an inverted drum sitting on top of it, which physically rises as gas collects underneath and sinks as you draw gas off. So you can tell at a glance how much fuel you have, and the weight of the drum keeps the pressure steady. The fixed dome design is the Chinese standard, a sealed masonry chamber built into the ground with no moving parts at all, where accumulating gas pushes slurry up into a side chamber and the difference in liquid levels supplies the pressure. Nothing to rust, nothing to seize, and some of these have been running for decades. And then there's the modern tube or bag digester, a long sealed flexible sleeve, cheap and quick to install, which simply inflates as it fills. Different materials, different budgets, identical principle: hold the waste, keep out the air, catch what rises. The feedstock is anything wet and organic: animal manure, food scraps, spoiled produce, crop residues. Manure is the classic starter, and there's a good reason for that. It's already full of exactly the right microbes, because those methanogens live in the digestive systems of animals. Feed a new digester some manure, and you're not just adding fuel, you're inoculating it with the workforce. What you generally keep out is anything that fights the process: large amounts of fat and grease, woody material that won't break down in a reasonable time, and anything antibacterial or chemically treated. Since your entire operation depends on keeping a delicate microbial population alive, the conditions matter enormously, and this is where most home attempts stall. Temperature is the big one. These microbes are sluggish when cold and productive when warm. That's why this technology thrives in tropical countries, and why a digester in a cold climate slows dramatically in winter and often needs to be insulated, buried, or heated to keep working. The mixture needs to stay properly wet, roughly like a thin slurry rather than a solid mass. It needs to stay sealed. Every leak is both lost gas and a safety issue, and it needs time. This is a slow biological process measured in weeks, not a machine you switch on. And what comes out is not pure methane. Raw biogas is usually somewhere around half to 2/3 methane, with most of the rest being carbon dioxide plus small amounts of other gases. That's why biogas burns with a gentler flame than bottled propane. There's inert carbon dioxide riding along, diluting it. It's completely usable for cooking, but you'll typically want burners suited to it, rather than assuming a propane appliance will behave the same way. Now the safety section, and I want you to actually listen to this part, because this is the one topic I've covered where carelessness can genuinely injure someone. First, methane is explosive. When methane mixes with air within a certain range, roughly 5 to 15%, it becomes an explosive mixture that any spark will ignite. That means gas must never be allowed to accumulate in an enclosed or occupied space. A digester belongs outdoors or in a very well-ventilated structure, never in a basement, a garage, or under a house. Keep ignition sources away from the digester and any place gas could collect. This is not an abstract risk. It is the reason gas leaks are treated so seriously everywhere else in your life. Second, and this is the one people don't know, raw biogas contains hydrogen sulfide. It's the rotten egg smell. And hydrogen sulfide is genuinely toxic. At high concentrations, it can kill. Here's the detail that makes it so dangerous. At those higher concentrations, it deadens your sense of smell. So the smell getting stronger is a warning, and the smell suddenly stopping is a far worse one. Never treat "I can't smell it anymore" as reassurance. This is also why serious setups scrub hydrogen sulfide out of the gas before burning it indoors, both for health and because it's corrosive to your equipment. Third, never enter a digester, and never let anyone else. A sealed tank that has held decomposing material is a confined space with no oxygen and toxic gas in it. People die this way every year in farm settings. In exactly this scenario, and very often, the second death is the person who climbed in to rescue the first. There is no version of this where entering is acceptable, and a mechanical one that catches beginners. Gas production creates pressure. A rigid sealed container with no pressure relief is a bomb waiting for a slow afternoon. Any real design has either a flexible gas holder, a floating dome, or a proper relief valve. Never simply seal a hard tank and walk away. Finally, check your local rules before you build anything. Depending on where you live, there may be regulations covering digesters, manure handling, and gas appliances, and there is no upside to finding that out afterwards. Now let me be honest about the limits, because I'd rather you go in clear-eyed. The output is modest. A small household digester produces enough gas to do a meaningful amount of daily cooking, and that's genuinely valuable. But it is not going to heat your house, run your generator, and fuel your truck. Anyone showing you a barrel in a backyard and implying energy independence is overselling it badly. It's a living system, not an appliance. It needs feeding regularly and consistently. It can be upset by the wrong inputs, and it takes weeks to establish and can take weeks to recover if it crashes. Cold weather knocks it down hard. This is closer to keeping livestock than to installing a water heater. And in a wealthy country with cheap piped gas, the honest economics are still what they were. It usually doesn't pay for itself in dollars alone. The people for whom this genuinely makes sense are those with a steady stream of waste they'd otherwise have to deal with. Smallholders, homesteaders, anyone with animals, and those who want the fertilizer and the closed loop as much as the fuel. If your only reason is saving money on propane, be realistic about the maths. Let me tell you what made this real for me. I'd read about biogas for years and filed it under the category of things that work in other countries. Then I saw a photograph of one of those Exeter lamps, a Victorian street lamp, in an English city burning sewer gas, more than a century ago, and something turned over in my head, because we tend to assume that anything old is primitive and anything modern is advanced. But those engineers were standing over a sewer, and instead of seeing a problem to be flushed away, they saw a fuel line running under their street. We have vastly better materials, better sensors, better understanding of the microbiology than they did. We simply stopped asking the question because a cheap pipeline answered it for us. They weren't behind us. On that particular point, they were looking at the world more carefully than we do. Let me answer the questions I know are coming. Can I really do this with my compost pile? No, an open-turned pile is aerobic and produces carbon dioxide, which doesn't burn. You need a sealed, airless digester. What's the best feedstock to start with? Animal manure. Because it comes preloaded with the right microbes, usually mixed with food and crop waste. How long until it produces gas? Weeks, not days. It takes time for the microbial community to establish. Does it work in cold climates? It works far more slowly and generally needs to be insulated, buried, or heated to keep going through winter. Is the gas the same as natural gas? The methane is the same molecule, but raw biogas is diluted with carbon dioxide, so it burns with less punch than bottled propane. What do I do with the leftover slurry? Use it. It's a genuinely good fertilizer, and it's half the reason the system is worth building. Does it smell? A properly sealed digester shouldn't stink in operation. Feeding and emptying are the smelly moments. And is it legal? Depends entirely on where you live. So check first. So here's the whole of it. Sealed away from air, ordinary waste stops rotting and starts brewing, and the microbes that take over exhale the same fuel a utility company pipes to your stove. The Victorians knew this, built it into a Bombay hospital in 1859, and lit the streets of an English city with sewer gas in 1895. Tens of millions of households cook with it today. It disappeared from the West for the least dramatic reason imaginable. Fuel got cheap enough that, thinking about it, stopped being worth anyone's time. The knowledge was never destroyed and never hidden. It was simply left behind by a country that could afford to. So tell me, down in the comments, had you ever heard about those Exeter sewer gas lamps? And if you keep animals or run a homestead, would you actually build one of these? I read every single one. Next time, I'm going to show you the Victorian machine that made ice in the middle of summer without electricity, decades before the refrigerator existed, and why the technology it used is quietly coming back. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and remember, the people who came before us were not looking at less than we are.